On June 12th, after years of delays, retooling, reshooting, a whole ass alleged crime spree from its lead actor, and a hyperbolic amount of hype from the studio, The Flash was finally released to theaters. And it bombed. Bombed. If Oppenheimer was still alive, he'd probably be taking notes. With a budget estimated somewhere between $250 to $300 million after marketing costs, the film has only grossed $269 million as of this recording. After its third week of release, the movie disappeared from the top 10. The Flash will go down as one of the most infamous box office bombs of all time. And I think they could have avoided all this, can't believe I'm saying this, if Zack Snyder directed The Flash. But before we get into why I think that is, let's talk about my feelings on Zack Snyder and how the DC universe got to this point. Zack Snyder, strangely, is one of the more polarizing filmmakers of our time. I myself am neither a fervent Snyderbro, nor do I harbor a vitriolic hatred for the man's worth. He's got some movies I dig and some movies I don't. I like Dawn of the Dead. I was 14 when 300 came out, so obviously it was my jam. I have mixed feelings on Watchmen, think it's solid as a movie, but it doesn't quite adapt the spirit of the comics. I can get down with the Owls of Ga'Hoole, and Army of the Dead is a bit too long and self-indulgent, but it's not without its charms. When it comes to Zack Snyder's DC Universe, well, I'm not the biggest fan. To give you some context, I've been a lifelong DC Comics fan. I started as a Batman obsessive when I was 3 years old, and as I got older and read more comics and watched more cartoons and the animated movies, that love spread to the DC Universe in totality. I just think it's one of the coolest fictional universes, bar none. When they announced that Man of Steel was going to be the start of a new, interconnected DC Universe, I was absurdly hyped, and that hype only increased after Man of Steel was released. Now, I love me some Superman. I love a traditional Superman. When people say Superman is boring, my response is, thanks for telling me you don't read comic books. Because if you read any of Grant Morrison's, Jeff Loeb's, or even more recently Philip Kennedy Johnson's work with the character, you'd know that Superman is far from boring. I didn't mind Snyder's more grounded take on the character because it felt like it was pulled right out of Superman Earth 1. I thought the action was one of the coolest visualizations of superpowered hand-throwing I'd seen up to that point, and the ending seemed to tease out a lighter, more traditional Superman movie for the follow-up. I was satisfied and excited for what's to come. And then Batman v Superman happened. This movie, in my humble opinion, was not very good. And yes, I have seen the 3-hour Ultimate Edition cut. I'm not a fake fan, y'all. I saw this movie twice in theaters because this was the movie I'd always dreamed of as a kid. Both as a movie I'd wanted to make, but predominantly as a movie I wanted to see. I had notebooks filled with the Batman v Superman logo and all kinds of ideas of what that movie would even look like as a kid. I even freaked out as a teenager during I Am Legend when they had that Batman Superman billboard because it was wild seeing that image on a big screen. And as both BVS and G4 taught me, that's a terrible thing when a dream comes true, only to disappoint you. I think Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice is a movie whose reach far exceeds its grasp. A lot of people had beef with the tone, which I understand, but that wasn't my main qualm. As a comic book reader, I know that every author is going to have their own take on a character. Hickman's X-Men and Morrison's X-Men are two very different beasts. Zack Snyder's DC Universe doesn't represent the traditional comic book roots of its central characters, but is instead his own interpretation. And honestly, I respect the hell out of that. It's a bold move in a genre that's mostly been defined by safe choices. The problem, for me, is I didn't think the move was well executed. The fun of a Batman-Superman team-up or battle is that they are two complete opposites, which makes for both fun conflict and interesting friendships. The problem with Batman v Superman is that you've got an angry paranoid guy versus a sad stoic guy. Personally, I think a more traditional Superman going up against Zack Snyder's Batman would have been a far more interesting conflict. Additionally, the plotting is haphazard and the script is trying to serve a lot of different beasts. It's trying to be a meditation on the moral quandaries and weight that comes with absolute power, as well as the corrosive nature of fear, while also teasing plotlines to come, laying the groundwork for an interconnected universe, and setting the stage for Justice League, which was set to release the following year. It's doing a lot, and it struggles under that weight. It's essentially taking a story fit for a 12-issue limited series and trying to graft a universe-building crossover onto it. Upon release, the movie was met with poor critical reviews and a polarized reception from fans and general audiences. Warner Brothers entered panic mode as the movie collapsed in its second weekend and they had just entered production on Justice League. The studio lost confidence in the vision they had greenlit and were essentially throwing out the plan that was laid out in favor of trying to course correct in real time. The first casualty was Suicide Squad. David Ayer's original vision was bastardized into a series of okay action scenes, awkward pacing, and needle drops so basic even Dutch Bros girls were like, this is a little much. It was lighter than BVS, but it also was so devoid of Ayer's whole vibe that it just screamed studio hack job. Unfortunately, tragedy struck Zack Snyder's family when his daughter Autumn committed suicide during post-production on Justice League. Initially planning to work through his grief, Snyder eventually stepped down from post-production of Justice League, and Joss Whedon stepped in to finish it out. Now, this sequence of events offended me less as a fan and more just as an artist and human being. What happened to Zack Snyder on Justice League, in no uncertain terms, is absolutely disgusting. While I may not have been crazy about BVS, the studio knew what they signed up for in getting Zack Snyder, an auteur with a very defined thing, to spearhead their universe. This man was enduring one of the deepest pains a person could experience, the death of a child. And instead of doing right by him, they took advantage of the situation, bastardized his vision, and constructed yet another studio hack job. They took the crown jewel of DC Comics and turned it into 2 hours of bad lighting and passable quips. Ultimately, Snyder would be vindicated 4 years later when his original vision was released on HBO Max and was revealed to be an actually cohesive movie that adheres to Snyder's take on the characters while also feeling like a sincere love letter to the DC universe at large. Anyway, in the wake of Justice League 2017, Snyder was out as the architect of the DC universe, and he was replaced by no one, really. The strategy post-J-League was essentially pretending the events of the Snyderverse never happened, while also continuing with the characters and aesthetics established within it. While this approach gave us bangers like Aquaman, The Suicide Squad, and Birds of Prey, we also got the creative misfires of Wonder Woman 1984 and Black Adam.
Hierarchy of power.
And this brings us to The Flash. As a result of the entire DCEU plan getting thrown out of the window, The Flash had a long road to development. Countless writers and directors have been brought in to take a crack at the movie, with none of the takes working for one reason or another. Some were too dark, some were too weird, and given the actual movie that came out, I'm gonna assume some of the takes were too damn good for Warner to take seriously. Eventually, it was settled that whatever form The Flash would take, it would essentially reset or realign the DCEU by adapting the Flashpoint storyline. For those that aren't aware, Flashpoint was a 2011 comics event that saw Barry Allen going back in time to prevent his mother's death, resulting in the DC universe becoming a darker, more violent place than the one he left. He eventually resets the timeline, but some shenanigans occur that result in the New 52 being born. When Walter Hamada was in charge, the events of The Flash were to lead into an adaptation of Crisis on Infinite Earths. The actual movie that came out, well, I guess this is where I should say spoilers for The Flash. So, The Flash is not a very good movie. It's not terrible, I've seen worse, it's just a movie that exists for the sake of existing. It's the epitome of a Member Berries movie. It doesn't offer anything new, instead it wheels out old faces and rehashes old events for no other reason than, remember that thing you liked that one time? You want to like it again? Well, yes. It is cool to see Michael Keaton don the cowl once more. It would have been more meaningful if it was for something other than what he was asked to do in The Flash. Michael Shannon gave a commanding performance as Zod, with both purpose and gravitas in Man of Steel. Whereas in Flash, he's just kinda there as an excuse for some third act nonsense. Flashpoint, and its phenomenal animated adaptation, The Flashpoint Paradox, work because the consequences of Barry's actions are so intense, violent, and at times devastating. The Flash movie, on the other hand, is without real stakes. A bunch of things just kind of happen, and then it ends. And speaking of the ending, oh boy. So, The Flash ends with a series of weird-ass CGI cameos that have no real dramatic or emotional bearing on what's happening beyond, hey, remember those Superman movies we made? Remember that Superman movie we didn't make? After this glorified showdown goes down, Barry resets the timeline, allowing his mother to die in the one genuinely emotional scene in the entire movie. He does change something ever so slightly, allowing his father's face to be seen in security camera footage so he doesn't wrongfully go to jail for his wife's death. I guess Barry didn't watch The Butterfly Effect or pay attention to the entire fucking movie he was just in, but anyway. The timeline is reset, and Barry's dad is exonerated of his mother's death using technology developed by Bruce Wayne. Bruce calls Barry to congratulate him on the victory and says he's going to meet him outside the courthouse. When Bruce pulls up, it's revealed that it's not Batfleck, but instead, George Clooney. Which, cool I guess? It's a fun gag, but considering that this movie was supposed to reset the DCEU and James Gunn has flat out said Clooney will not be the Batman of the new DCEU. It begs the question, what exactly was the point of this? It doesn't work as a stirring conclusion of the DCEU, and it doesn't explicitly set up what's to come next. It feels less like a reset and more like a placeholder. And this brings me to the whole reason you clicked on this video. Why I think Zack Snyder should have directed The Flash. Took me a minute to get there, but damn it, I got there, baby. The Flash, as it currently exists, is a nothing burger of a movie. No real interesting themes, ideas, or concepts it's playing with. The character arcs are kinda there, I guess, but Barry doesn't feel like a different person at the end of the movie than he does at the beginning. Especially because he ends the movie doing the exact same thing that messed up the timeline in the first goddamn place. If The Flash wasn't going to end by explicitly teasing out or establishing some new element of what's to come, then it should have doubled down on being the last stand of the DCEU. I think having Zack Snyder direct The Flash would have been the classy move on Warner's part, given the J-League debacle, and honestly just would have been fitting. It would have been cool to see the guy who launched this universe be the one to close it out. I think the Flashpoint story, in general, has built-in narrative beats that would have allowed for some payoffs to the unresolved plot threads and character beats established in Man of Steel and BVS. As I mentioned earlier, the Flashpoint comic and movie are very, very dark. The epitome of actions having some mother effing consequences. One of the earliest teases of things never to come in the DCEU was the Nightmare. In Batman v Superman, Bruce has a vision of a future where Darkseid has claimed dominion over Earth and Superman has assumed the role of despotic godhead. This vision is punctuated by Barry going through the Speed Force to warn Bruce that he's right about Clark. This moment was simply baffling in theaters, I'm not gonna lie, but in Snyder's original outline for the DCEU, the Justice League sequels were going to primarily take place in the Nightmare and be about the team struggling to survive in this apocalyptic landscape. Clearly, that didn't happen, but The Flash could have been a way to pay that off. Instead of creating an alternate timeline with no superheroes, what if Barry changing the timeline set off the sequence of events that led to Darkseid acquiring the anti-life equation and corrupting the Man of Steel? A disruption in time so severe it's echoed through the multiverse via the Nightmare. Bruce wasn't right about Clark. He was wrong about Barry. His irresponsible and selfish act led to the most selfless among them being reduced to Darkseid's lapdog and unleashed an unprecedented era of terror across the planet. Actions, consequences. Now, depowered and trapped within this dystopic future, Barry has to figure out how to regain his powers, regain the trust of the Justice League, and how to save the future. Supergirl could still even factor in the story, as she was teased in Man of Steel. She could be the force multiplier they desperately search for to even the fight against Superman and his Legion. This approach would have given all the heroes established in the Snyderverse a chance to shine. Snyder is a noted fan of dramatic irony, and I imagine his approach would embrace the irony of it taking the literal end of the world for us to finally see the messy, deeply flawed heroes of the Snyderverse in their most heroic light. It would also have a core theme about the inherent sacrifice that comes with heroism, a Snyder-ass theme if I ever saw. This arc would have allowed Barry to have a real character journey. By seeing how horrifically off the rails everything can go if he's not responsible with his power, Barry comes out with a genuine respect for his abilities and the weight they carry. I would have much rather this than the cameo fest and CGI babies that put American Sniper to shame. A Snyder approach would have probably had better effects too, just given that Snyder has had decades working in effects-driven movies, and say what you will about the content of his films, but Snyder's reputation as a premier visual stylist has been more than earned. Lastly, even if this version didn't explicitly set up the new DCU, at least it'd be a very clear and hopefully rousing finale to the last decade of DC films. While there's been plenty of haters, myself somewhat including, depending on what movie we're talking about,
the hierarchy of power in the DC universe,
you can't deny that there's an audience that has a sincere and fervent appreciation for what Snyder established during his time with the DC universe. And while I do have my reservations and critiques about a certain level of fandom, there are folks like me who like the DCEU more than they disliked it. Sure, Suicide Squad, Black Adam, and BVS weren't my cup of tea. But I loved the first Wonder Woman. I thought the first Shazam was delightful, the Suicide Squad was great, and I love Birds of Prey. As someone who collected Gail Simone's runs as a kid, the DCEU experiment was worth it simply because I got to see the Birds of Prey on the silver screen. If The Flash was really meant to end the DCEU as it stands, then it should have respected the fact that, well, no, it never reached Marvel levels of success. There were folks who picked up what it was putting down, even through the highs and lows. Instead, we got a movie that feels embarrassed of its lineage as opposed to celebrating it. The Flash could have genuinely been an event film if, A, they didn't have to promote around their star, honestly, that's kind of, a death nail, but B, they didn't hype it up as one of the greatest films ever made, which, to quote this kid,
a bullshit?
Just saying, wasn't the greatest film ever made. It wasn't even the greatest film I saw in June. Shout out to Spider-Verse. Anyway, if the movie was positioned as the epic conclusion of the DC universe, anchored by the person who brought it into existence in the first place, they could have restored the Snyderverse by giving it a definitive and satisfying conclusion, paying off audience investment, setting the table for the future, and most importantly, making a movie that it had at least some semblance of a take. Because say what you will about Zack Snyder, the man has takes. He has a very clear way of doing things, and honestly, I would take someone with a very clear, this is my thing, over just the generic mush we've gotten this summer between The Flash, Transformers, and whatever other movie I probably forgot that came out this summer. So with that, I leave it to you. Do you agree? Disagree? Let me know in the comments. Also, I know things can, for some reason, get heated when discussing Zack Snyder, so let's keep it respectful, folks. We can disagree on superhero movies without being jerks. That's really what I want this place to be. So if you dug this, feel free to like and subscribe. We'd love to have you. So with that, I'm Joe, and you just experienced wonder.